Hello and welcome to Maiden, Mother, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Geoffrey Miller. He's an evolutionary psychologist, associate professor of psychology at the University of New Mexico, and the author of many books, including most recently Virtue Signalling, Essays on Darwinian Politics and Free Speech, which was published in 2019. We spoke today about a whole host of issues related to evolutionary psychology, from how the belief in the blank slate makes parenting much more difficult, why status games and runaway consumerism have a tendency to suppress fertility, whether or not private schooling is a scam. And in the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about polyamory, Geoffrey's personal experiences, views on polyamory, whether or not it's growing in influence as a sort of mating model, and whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not it's going to entrench all the various problems associated with the sexual revolution. That extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband, the MMM chat community, and the whole back catalogue of extended episodes. Enjoy.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM.
Should we start by talking about your Fermi's paradox theory, which I've the Great Temptation thesis?
Yeah, I wrote this very short piece about 15 years ago. When I was writing my book Spent, which is kind of a Darwinian critique of runaway consumerism, I kept thinking about, maybe we're not the only species that gets caught up in runaway consumerism. Maybe there are other extraterrestrial intelligences, and maybe they also develop technology, and maybe a lot of their technology is kind of tempting and distracting the way that video games are tempting and distracting, or the way that porn is tempting and distracting. And so maybe that's actually a partial explanation of why we don't see a lot of glorious extraterrestrial civilizations out there, that maybe there's this tendency for any evolved nervous system, any evolved intelligence, to sort of get a little bit distracted by particular kinds of runaway consumerism, particularly interactive entertainment technology. And back when I wrote this around 2007, 2008, I was focused mostly on video games and computer games, being kind of a long time enthusiast for Sid Meier's Civilization game, which is quite popular among Aspergery type guys like me. And, more recently, one could speculate about the rise of virtual reality and augmented reality and deep fakes and all of the newer sort of AI-fueled technologies that might also be kind of a civilizational and biological distraction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so the theory relies on the idea that any sufficiently intelligent extraterrestrial being would also hit this problem, where they can create. Do you like the term limbic capitalism? It's a slightly more ideologically sort of loaded term, I guess, but I guess what we might call limbic capital, or it doesn't even have to be capitalist. It just needs to be types of entertainment which are incredibly enticing. We can assume that other intelligent beings are likely to create exactly that kind of tech and run into the same problems that we do.
I think so. And the key kind of insight from my field of evolutionary psychology is that animals typically evolve to track proxies for fitness, cues of fitness, rather than biological fitness itself, rather than actual reproductive success. So as long as you're surrounded by cues of success that say, I have high social status, I'm sexually attractive and validated, and even maybe I'm interacting with fake or virtual babies and children rather than actual biological children. I think it's very, very hard for evolved nervous systems to escape that kind of cue-based decision making and stay laser focused on, but wait, am I actually surviving and actually reproducing, or am I just feeding myself these fake cues of fitness?
Let's go into that a little bit more for people who might be new to this idea. So what is the difference in practice between a fitness cue and an actual demonstration of reproductive fitness? Like, what's the explain the distinction more?
For example, you see the gap in the kind of red pill manosphere pickup artist community, right? Where guys are running around and they're chasing cues of sexual success, cues of sexual validation. So they might be having sex with a lot of apparently fertile young women, but they're not actually having babies. Why not? Contraception, right? So they're cutting the link between chasing these cues of sexual success, which is like getting laid a lot, but they're not actually having babies. So from a Darwinian point of view, right, what they're doing is actually no better reproductively than staying home and watching porn, right? Evolution doesn't care whether you're staying home and watching porn or having non-reproductive, non-conceptive sex with a bunch of women. It's equally futile from a Darwinian point of view. So my concept with this sort of limbic capitalism insight is that an awful lot of what we're doing is sort of running around chasing these fitness cues and kind of forgetting to have actual babies. So this kind of ties into my pronatalism enthusiasm and my kind of concern about demographic collapse and birth rates and all of that stuff.
Yeah, concern that we share. So the trap that we end up in at this point of development as an intelligent species is that we are so good at distracting ourselves from the actual sort of bare bones of Darwinian selection that we just become extinct. Like, ultimately, like it's a very real existential threat to a species, even though it doesn't feel like that in the moment. It doesn't feel like plague and war and asteroids and all of that sort of thing, but it's the effects is pretty much the same.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't feel like an existential threat the way that global thermonuclear war felt as a potential threat in the 80s when I was growing up and going to college and worried about that. It doesn't feel like even an existential threat the way that artificial superintelligence feels. And yet, the better the AI gets, the more tempting all of these interactive media will get, so that you'll end up with a bunch of young people running around with virtual boyfriends and girlfriends rather than real boyfriends and girlfriends. Or if they have any parental instincts, right, they might even fulfill those instincts by having kind of virtual babies or kids that they interact with a little bit. At the end of that essay that I wrote 15 years ago, I did have a kind of glimmer of hope that I offered, which is that there might be certain human subcultures that are relatively resistant to getting caught up in this trap. But they tend to be kind of religious fundamentalist groups that are wary of technology in general. And I mentioned specifically kind of fundamentalist Muslims and fundamentalist Amish or Mennonites or like real hardcore trad lifers who are just generally skeptical of electronic technology. So as long as some people are still having kids, right, human evolution continues, and there will gradually evolve a resistance to video games, a resistance to virtual reality, a kind of horror of those things as being, after a few hundred generations, you could sort of imagine people having the same disgust and horror and animosity towards video games that they now have towards highly infectious, dangerous parasites.
Mm. But I suppose it's more of a, if we're thinking about religious subcultures, it's a form of cultural resistance. Presumably, there are also some individuals who are more resistant to the delights of limbic capitalism. And
Yes.
would we expect that also to be selected for, regardless of which subculture they come from?
Yeah, exactly. I think any heritable individual differences that can be passed on genetically, or passed on culturally, will tend to spread under this kind of limbic capitalism context. So, like, you're into having babies, I'm into having babies. Lots of people are. They don't necessarily need a religious fundamentalist reason to do it, although it can help. Um, and so you can predict that over generations, as long as humanity survives at all, that the kind of people who are still laser focused on actual reproductive success will end up being the ones who are great grandparents to many descendants, and the ones who are easily distracted will end up being great grandparents to nobody.
Do you think it's possible that people might just break out? I mean, limbic capitalism offers a whole load of different distractions, right? Not just in relation to actual reproduction. Do you think that some people might break out just sort of from the reproductive trap, but otherwise continue to enjoy video games, to continue to enjoy junk food, Or do you think that maybe there's uh, a suite of personality traits which makes one resistant to all of it? Is it sort of all or nothing? Either you are sucked into the great temptation and you end up sterilizing yourself, or you're not. What do you think?
I think there's a happy middle ground. I mean, I try to follow that happy middle ground myself. I mean, God knows I'm pretty addicted to Twitter, aka X, right? And yet I still try to be a pretty good dad to my kids. I will still occasionally play Civilization, the video game, and watch TV, and do all the other normal, like, middle class entertainment stuff. So I think you don't have to be super puritanical about resisting this great temptation, and you could probably have, like, about 70% as much limbic capitalist fun as incels and non-breeders and non-parents have, and still have kids. But the worry is, well, play it forward another 20 or 30 years, right? How good will the distractions get? How good will AI fake girlfriends and boyfriends get? How good will immersive virtual reality get? You could get to a point where it's just extremely hard to resist those temptations unless you never start them in the first place. Kind of like a lot of people know, oh, if I tried heroin once, I probably would become a smackhead, and so I just won't do it at all.
It seems to me as well that one of the other problems with the ever better consumer options is runaway status signaling. And because I mean, that's very strongly the impression I get as to why the sort of upper middle classes seem to be particularly averse to having children. It's because they're not like the very rich, who, I think that in America it's something like, when you have an income of over 500,000 a year, your birth rate goes up again. But there's this big valley in the middle where people don't have enough money to just spend as much as they want on consumables and on status signifying consumables, crucially. And they know that there's a trade-off between having children and having all of these nice house, nice car, all of these things, holidays. And so they choose the status game over the having children game. Obviously, we see the Darwinian implications of that. do you think that that as well is a do you think that that is a particular function of the sort of modern offerings? You know, there is absolutely no ceiling on the amount of money that you can spend on making yourself seem high status, right? Compared with other cultures. Or is it, I don't know, but maybe that was always true. Maybe it's just maybe it's just that we have contraception and our ancestors didn't. Maybe they would have also whittled all of their money away on things that made them look high status. I don't know.
I mean, consumerist capitalism is incredibly inventive about offering these kinds of status-seeking opportunities, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of diversity, so that no matter what your personality traits, no matter what your personal interests and values, there's going to be some kind of status game you can play that will appeal to that value. So, for example, you could be anti-materialist, you could be an intellectual, you could go, oh, I don't care about status through yachts and Fendi handbags, but I do care about status for getting a PhD and tenure and all that cool stuff, right? And that's my status game. And so it's the diversity of different kinds of consumables and goods and services and different career options that mean almost everybody faces some kind of temptation to get caught up in runaway status games somehow, right? And that's kind of a distinctive thing about modernity that perhaps didn't exist in the same way, 1,000 years ago. And that was a major point of my book, Spent, that there's this fundamental trade-off between runaway status seeking versus having babies. And man, consumerist capitalism is very, very good at offering this smorgasbord of status enhancing opportunities.
Do you think it's possible that in the past we might have generated more of this runaway consumer status signaling if we'd had contraception? But because we didn't have reliable contraception, people just sort of ended up having to have children
Mhm.
if they wanted to have sex. And so it just wasn't possible. Do you think that that's maybe the crucial limiting factor historically?
Yeah, I think contraception is absolutely crucial. There's basically two epochs of human history. There's before contraception was effective and after contraception is effective. And once you get effective contraception, everything changes in terms of demographics and parenting and reproduction. And um, so, and it didn't just happen in the 60s, right? There's this false idea that, oh, we didn't really get a demographic transition until about 60, 70 years ago. No, there were already fairly effective condoms in the mid to late 1800s. Women have been, to some degree, controlling their fertility for 150, 200 years or so, but it's just much, much more effective nowadays. So that if you're a young woman and you're determined to go to grad school, become an academic, become an investment banker, whatever, you can do that pretty reliably, particularly if you've got abortion as the backstop. And likewise, if you're a young man, right, you can potentially have a sexual career that involves a lot of one-night stands and girlfriends and even long-term relationships without kids popping out. Whereas hundreds of years ago, you're right, the status seeking is intrinsically limited by babies popping out and then human nature taking over and parents going like, oh, but they're cute and I love them and I want to take care of them. And so, no, it's not worth trying to become, the best shoemaker in London or whatever their status game is, right?
People do play status games with their kids, of course. I guess it's just that kids take such a lot of uh, resources. Well, that's slightly question begging, isn't it? Because one of the reasons why children take up a lot of resources in kind of modern parenting culture is because we play status games with our
Mm-hmm.
kids.
Yeah.
Like if we weren't spending so much money on ballet classes and private schools and all of this, children would be cheaper. Do you think that that's also another cap on fertility because people think you have to spend so much money to raise healthy, happy children.
Yeah, and this is why, to an annoying degree, I run around recommending Brian Kaplan's book, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, which is kind of a behavior genetics critique of runaway parental consumerism, right? And I'm very much on board with this behavior genetics insight that, your kids are born and they've got a mix of the genes from you and your partner, and they're going to turn out to have whatever cognitive traits and intelligence and personality traits that they have based largely on genes, and there's not a whole lot you can do to change that. So the implication for parents is relax, let your kids be who they are, let them grow up, don't try to shape them, don't try to hothouse them, don't try to manipulate them at the micro level to become some little status object that you show off, but rather like feed them and they grow and they'll be fine. And so the limbic capitalism isn't just seizing on our status-seeking instincts, it's also seizing on our parenting instincts, right? Competitive parenting. My kids are better than your kids, so that makes me a better person somehow. And I think getting caught up in that also can inhibit, the number of kids that you have. And this is all very much in the context of my own family, where my mom was one of 12 kids. And I grew up just a few blocks away from many, many uncles and aunts who I played with regularly, and we were on the same swim team. And I saw the viability of having a very, very large family. And I saw that, oh, wow, they don't need to be hot-housed. Once you've got that many kids, they kind of largely take care of each other. And, my maternal grandmother was not sort of running these kids around to endless ballet lessons. And they did activities, but they did not have the kind of intensive parenting that your typical modern bourgeois parents would strive for.
Mm. It's amazing, isn't it, how often the blank slate view of child development, and indeed the blank slate view, full stop, is portrayed as being the compassionate option, that they're somehow cuddlier and kinder than the hereditarian view, even a partial hereditarian view. And not only is the blank slate view implicated in the horrors of communism and deaths of millions of people, right? It's also often a great unkindness to parents, actually, to make them believe that they are absolutely responsible every minute of every day for, forming their children's futures. And that, for instance, it used to be the belief that autism was a consequence of the refrigerator mothers, right? Women being cold to their children, and women, would torture themselves with guilt for feeling as if they were responsible for their children's autism, whereas in fact we know that we don't know entirely what causes autism, but some of it is certainly genetic, and the refrigerator mother idea has been debunked, and yet the tiger mothers cling on to that kind of view of the necessity of intensive parenting.
Yeah, the moms were blamed for autism, the moms were blamed for schizophrenia, the parents are blamed for depression, and in modern sort of therapy culture, right, the parents are routinely blamed for everything wrong with kids. And when the kids go to therapy as teenagers or in college or as young adults, right, many therapists will say, well, whatever distresses you, that's because of some kind of hidden childhood trauma, and we must unearth it. And I think that's an incredible disservice to hundreds of millions of parents, right, to blame them for stuff that may be largely genetic or just kind of random. So that's the exact opposite of compassion, right? And this is another side effect of having small families, right? If you've got big families and half a dozen kids in any given family, and some of them turn out great and some of them turn out kind of messed up, then it's obviously not due to the family dynamics or the parenting or some kind of, hidden family trauma. It's just, that's the way different cookies crumble over time. But when you've got only one kid per family, like in China, right, and the parents feel entirely to blame if that child does not get into Beijing University and become, a billionaire. That's a horrible burden to put on parents.
Yes, and as we've said already, you end up with parents thinking that they have to invest so much money and effort into children when like private schools are a complete scam. You might pay for private schools. The situation where I might pay for private school is if it was the only option in order to avoid, let's say, negative socialization. So avoiding children going to a school where they're liable to be bullied or exposed to, well, I mean, exposed to like the worst kinds of limbic capitalism, for instance, or going to a school where all the kids are addicted to porn and video games and so on. You might want to spend money on private schooling that would avoid that outcome. But in terms of academic results, private schools are
Yeah.
a scam. I don't think they know that they're a scam, but I think they are.
Yeah, I have kind of mixed feelings about them. I think you're right. You're mostly paying to avoid the negatives of certain kinds of public schools. But a few weeks ago, you met my my grown daughter, Adelanta Xanthi, and man, she had a great time at Westminster School in London, which was expensive. But I'm going to flex a little bit here now. Like she qualified for a good merit scholarship, so we would not have been able to afford it otherwise. And Westminster School is one of these very elite private schools in London with incredibly good teachers and wonderful other students and a great social community. And no doubt my daughter was much, much happier there than she would have been in a typical public school. Would it have been worth the full freight tuition of, well, whatever, 30, 40,000 pounds a year? I don't know. But certainly the bourgeois parent susceptibility to paying for private school is largely, I think, a result of this blank slate mentality, right? That says I can shape my kid to be much, much better, more competitive, smarter than all those other kids, and I can do it through throwing money at the problem.
Yeah, the risk with going kind of full Brian Kaplan on not only on the pronatalism, but also on the idea that education is well, because he has this other book, right, called The Case Against Education, which is very persuasive and very interesting. But yeah, one risk of going sort of full throttle on that is you end up forgetting that you can, to some extent, shape your children's happiness. You can certainly make them, they might get academic results that are the same pretty much whichever school they go to, but they can also definitely be completely miserable at some schools and not others. So you still have some responsibility as a parent in that regard. I guess what's discouraged and what I support discouraging is making children miserable by making them spend hours a day playing violin or whatever it is, when actually the goal you think you're achieving, you're not very likely to achieve.
Yeah, I think it's especially important for parents not to get caught up in these winner-take-all contests where you're trying to encourage your kid to become like an Olympic pole vaulter, which requires like intense athletic training from age 8 or 10 onwards, or like unless they become first violin in some major symphony orchestra, then they're a failure, and therefore they must practice violin many, many hours a day from age 6 onwards. I think that's horrible. It's child abuse. It's miserable. I would be happy to live in a world where the first violins weren't quite as good and where the pole vaulters didn't get over quite as high a bar. And yet all the kids had, a happy, well-rounded childhood.
Do you think, though, that maybe some of this status seeking from parents is inevitable, and even if everyone became persuaded of the sort of hereditarian argument, maybe we would divert our status seeking behaviors into some other game?
I think no doubt there's always going to be individual differences in parents, and some of them are going to derive a lot of their self-esteem and their identity from the success of their kids, and others will get it more from their own success or just contributing to society or being an effective altruist or whatever else they do. And that's fine. I think, in a way, I would rather parents get uh, status by proxy from their kids excelling at sports or music than get some kind of status by proxy from, here's my kid, they're age 5, they're trans. You know, like there's some really pathological ways that can go.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There are definitely worse ways of using your children in status games. Yes. Um, or I guess people might, I maybe it's worse to completely neglect your children's achievements and focus on other status games we can play, for instance, in relation to sexual signaling and, continuing to prioritize your own uh, sort of sexy status signifiers and completely neglecting your children. Because I mean, generally, I suppose most parents will. Well, I don't know. Here's a question: to once people become parents, do they start investing fewer resources in doing that kind of sexual attractiveness signaling?
Typically, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's still a bit. I mean, one of the things I learned from reading, David Buss, for instance, in one of his most recent books, is the tendency that women have, even if they don't realize it, to always be lining up a backup mate
Yeah.
just in case. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the yeah, so that all of that sexual signaling stuff does still go on.
Yeah. Biologists talk about this concept called life history theory, and life history theory posit there's fundamental trade-offs in life in terms of time and energy and effort. And one fundamental trade-off is attracting mates versus parenting existing offspring. So mating versus parenting, fundamental trade-off. And you often see organisms switch back and forth between like mating mode and parenting mode, right? This happens all the way down to insects, reptiles, birds, etc. And a lot of our hormonal physiology is about modulating that trade-off, right? So when guys have kids and become dads, their testosterone drops. Adaptively, it's supposed to drop. It's supposed to mean you're allocating less effort to mating and more to parenting. So the guys who become dads and think, oh no, my testosterone's dropped, I need to take testosterone replacement therapy. No, 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 you're missing the entire point of the adaptive physiology, which is to switch you into dad mode, right? And that's okay. That's what you're supposed to be doing. Um, and likewise with moms, right? There's a huge shift from status seeking and mate attraction efforts into being in mom mode and focusing on the little ones. Now, does it shift 100%? No, right? Because you still have legit incentives, right, for maintaining some degree of sexual attractiveness, at least for the partner you're having kids with, right? But also in the case of women, as you say, cultivating potential backup mates in case the dad wanders off on a hunting trip and dies, or goes off to warfare and dies, and you want your kids to be taken care of, and the guy you're with would have even wanted you to have a backup mate under those conditions, so that his kids have now a new stepdad, right, to look over them and protect them, and that's legit.
And so much of this is subconscious or unconscious, right? That's what's sort of amazing about our psychology in relation to mating. I've often had the experience of reading evolutionary psychologists, including reading your work, and thinking, oh my goodness, yes, I do that, and I've never thought about it. I've never done this consciously, but I recognize myself in this. Do you think that kind of do you think there's something adaptive about that kind of submerging some of this decision making psychologically and not being completely aware of it? Like, I know that women do that in relation to intersexual competition with other women, that we will be aggressive to other women in direct ways, and we will not be honest with ourselves very, very often about that aggression. And in a sense, that's uh, that lack of self-awareness is adaptive in that it makes the show of hidden aggression all the more convincing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one reason I love evolutionary psychology is I feel like it gives me extra superpower insights into myself and the people around me. But it also is very good at identifying why are we so self-deceived, right? So there's a concept of adaptive self-deception from biologist Robert Trivers, and it has to do with kind of plausible deniability, right? Like if a woman is right, married and leaving the kids at home with a babysitter and going out to a party with a husband, and she's really invested in looking good and having makeup and having sexy dress and cleavage, and right, she might unconsciously be like, I still want at least some male attention and some sexual validation and people thinking I'm hot, and possibly even more than that, like a backup mate or mate switching or lining up people or having an affair or whatever. But if she's consciously aware of that, it kind of spoils the plausible deniability. Because then if the husband is like, wow, you look surprisingly good, but why? Like, you don't normally make this kind of effort, right? The correct plausible deniability answer is, it's just for me. I just feel good when I look good. And it's not for male attention. It's not to look better than all the other suburban housewives. It's just self-esteem, man, right? And that's, I guess, plausible to some husbands if women say that. And also, as you say, in terms of female versus female competition, my colleague here at University of New Mexico, Tanya Reynolds, has analyzed the way that women use kind of very sneaky forms of gossip to diss other female friends, right, in a kind of show of sympathy. Like, I'm really worried about, you know, Barbara, because her drinking is kind of out of control a little bit, and it might hurt her, and I think we need an intervention. And the subtext of that is, this other friend is not reliable and not high status, and we should probably dump her, right? But it's framed as a display of empathy and concern, and that gives plausible deniability to the female competition.
Concern trolling is the expression when you do that on Twitter. Yeah. Yeah, very effective tool. Yeah, so it's essential to some of this to much of this adaptive behavior to lie to yourself and to believe the lie.
Yeah, and I think this is one reason actually why evolutionary psychology gets a lot of flack from people. Like they kind of realize, oh no, I don't actually want it to become common knowledge quite how competitive and self-serving many of my motivations really are. Or a lot of people just can't really look in the mirror and recognize how driven by these kinds of instincts a lot of their behavior is. So it's better to kind of sweep it under the rug and have a sort of denial-based lifestyle.
Mm. Yes, evolutionary psychology does paint a very unflattering view of humans. If you want to believe that humans are all, you know, terribly kind and soft and whatever. I mean, it does, of course, demonstrate we can often be very altruistic, but I suppose it spells out the exact reasons in terms of selection why we would be altruistic, which maybe makes it seem less. It doesn't make it any less self-sacrificing. I mean, it clearly is the case that we will sacrifice enormously for the sake of our children and so on. It's just, of course, that it's our genes that are driving us to do it.
I mean, there's a very bright side to it all. If you accept the Darwinian premises of, yeah, we evolved through reproductive competition, and the only traits that can really last are those that uh, yield some kind of reproductive benefit somehow, right? Initially, that sounds like a very dark message, but throughout my whole research career, I've tried to emphasize the brighter aspects of it, which is like, this is how you get art and music and humor and creativity in courtship, right? Because those things paid. And like, what more could you ask for from courtship than that kind of beautiful, aesthetic, creative expression, right? That's about as good an outcome as you could reasonably hope for from evolution, right? And likewise with altruism, like when we show genuine concern for our offspring and our family members and our tribe mates and our clan mates, and even we virtue signal in terms of giving goods and services to total strangers just so that we can increase our own status, right? To me, that's beautiful. That again is about the best you could hope for from any natural process that doesn't rely on some kind of like supernatural moral instinct. I think it's only relative to some kind of moral standard that like hardcore communists would hope for, that like we should be equally altruistic to all humans and perhaps all sentient animals. Like, okay, fine, but explain to me what kind of evolutionary process would ever deliver that kind of human nature. It's not going to happen.
Yes, these kind of heat maps that you see shared online sometimes with sort of the traditional, the conservative, the adaptive, whatever heat map in terms of moral concerns. You're most concerned about your own children, your family, your neighborhood, whatever outwards, and then the whatever you want to call it, the woke version has that exactly
Yeah,
flipped, so that you're supposed to forego having children, in fact, for the sake of the planet or whatever, and have greatest moral concern for people on the other side of the world. And no one really operates like that, I don't think, but you're certainly supposed to. That's held up as the sort of leftist ideal to completely upend how you would normally prioritize relationships.
yeah. So I think it's important for reasonable centrists and conservatives to be willing to say that like the heat map where most of your altruism is fairly locally focused is virtuous, is legitimate, is as good as you could reasonably expect. And if you want to move beyond that, right, and you want to become like a full-blown effective altruist, which I try to be, like you can apply reason and evidence and try to make your particular virtue signaling strategy consistent with that. But you shouldn't go around, dissing people for failing to live up to that kind of rather bizarre, counterintuitive moral system.
One that, as you say, I mean, there'd be no reason that humans would ever develop such a. It's so wildly like anti, you know, in our interests to behave in that, in our genetic interest to behave in that way. No one is like that. And in fact, I sort of think that. Well, I was reflecting on recently on the fact that what Christianity does, because often people, of course, will employ Christian rhetoric or Christian adjacent rhetoric to justify this kind of reversed heat map moral concern thing by using the phrase love your neighbor and similar. And I was reflecting on the fact that one, what love your neighbor says literally is your neighbor. It's actually people close to you in this kind of orbit of concern, one. But two, that what Christianity seems to do very effectively is to is to is to nudge the normal altruism boundaries, is to basically encourage you to treat the people within your church community as if they were related to you, even if they're not actually related to you. So it's not about inverting the concern hierarchy. It's more about slightly expanding the altruistic sort of containment zone to encompass some people who don't necessarily share your genetic interests, except maybe they do, in that there is obviously a sort of group selection effect where if you have groups of people who are particularly good at kind of working together, and that there is a selection advantage in having community cohesion, even if not everyone is actually related to one another.
Yeah, it's a leveraging of normal parental and family instincts, right? And you're creating what anthropologists call fictive kinship. You're treating people as kin who aren't actually kin. So it's fictive, it's fictional, but it's kinship. So everybody in the congregation, they're all my brothers and sisters, right? Yeah, and you do this in the military also. Like everybody in my platoon, they're my brothers. I die for them, whatever. And the irony is, the socialists and the wokes and the communists will also use the same rhetoric, right? Of brotherhood and sisterhood, and we're all one big human family, blah, blah, blah. And yet they don't actually respect the underlying emotions and instincts, right? It's as if, yeah, we have to treat everybody as within the family, but families themselves have no moral validity. So that's a very strange perspective. I think you're right. Christianity is sort of more morally coherent in terms of saying these parental and family instincts are legitimate and valid and God-given and worth celebrating, and we should just expand them a little bit to our neighbors. Not to everybody, but people in our clan, our tribe, nearby people.
To change the subject slightly, although pulling on some of the same themes that we've been talking about so far, polyamory. We have, I interviewed some years ago. I don't know if you remember, for a piece I wrote about polyamory at the time, because you had written some very really interesting work on how polyamory may well come to be a more sort of dominant relationship model as time goes by, and two, the ways in which it can be most stable and work most effectively, because there are so many different models available. Could you talk a little bit about those different models? Because I'm not sure if many people are aware of how different polyamory can look in different contexts.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.